Check, check.
Hello. Good afternoon. Sorry, we'll just start in a minute. Hello, am I audible?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is everything good? Everything working?
Good afternoon, Professor Livingstone. Nice to meet you and welcome to the ICA Manipal Hub. And thank you for talking to us. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us.
Thank you so much for the
We'll
invitation.
have a few questions for you, but before that, we'd ask you to talk to us a little bit about your work.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be to see people in the room and to be with you today. My work. So I'm a professor of social psychology. I began as a social psychologist. I spent many years working on media audiences across many different areas of their everyday lives. And I have kind of been tracking the way in which digital media have become increasingly important in the public sphere, in the private sphere, and as they transform as part of the infrastructure of our societies. And in the last 15 years, perhaps, my focus has really been on children and young people, increasingly with a rights focus, thinking about the risks and opportunities and forms of support that they need to live and thrive in a digital world.
Thank you, Professor. You are a psychologist by training, so is there an advantage, for a psychologist to work in, audience studies and user studies and these related spheres?
No, I don't think so. I think media and communication science, whatever we call it, is a fantastically multidisciplinary space. That's what I really like about it. So what I appreciate is that we have a conversation in our field that brings together people with many different specialisms. So I speak in part according to how I was trained, but also precisely in a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary space where it is really crucial to understand today's communication environment, that we speak as psychologists, sociologists, cultural analysis, lawyers, economists, technologists, and of course those trained within our field in media and communication itself. So each brings something, each has something distinctive to say, and perhaps a preference for familiar methods and theories that we kind of have a history with. But to my mind, it's the interdisciplinary dialogue and negotiation that really makes our field so vibrant.
So coming back to your work with children, can you tell us what are the children's rights in the digital world?
Yes, they are all the rights that children have in the world. So for the last few years, I've been working, perhaps a little history is that for a long time I was doing research on children's risks online and children's opportunities online and trying to keep them together. But people would, was very common, I think, for people to focus on one particular dimension of children's lives. And what I really appreciate about a child rights framework is that it's resolutely holistic and integrative. And so the Convention on the Rights of the Child proves a really interesting framework, I think, for our field. And it sets out 40 areas of right, 41 areas of rights: the right to education, the right to privacy, the right to information, to expression, to play, to protection, to family life, and so on. And the challenge for us in our field really is to work out, what do those things mean in a digital world? Does privacy, the right to privacy, mean data protection? Does the right to protection require safety by design in the big tech companies? Does what does the right to play? I've been writing a lot about play recently. What does children's right to play mean? Does it mean just does it mean only play outside, or does it also mean play online? So I think these are all, you know, there are lots of questions and new players who need to have a role in children's protecting and realizing children's lives in the digital environment, most obviously tech companies themselves.
Okay. So children's experiences with digital technologies have been documented mostly in the global north. How do you think these experiences are different for children in the global south?
Well, it's not for me to tell you that. I can tell you what research I've seen. So a few years ago with UNICEF, I began a project called Global Kids Online, which has really tried hard to build a framework that allows for research in multiple countries. And we have especially sought research in the global south to be done on a comparable basis. And the idea of comparable research, so that you could compare how many children, let's say, encounter cyberbullying online in Europe or in India or in Ghana or in Argentina, you know, so there is some advantage to making these comparisons, and Global Kids Online has tried to draw those together. It doesn't always capture the nuances and perhaps some of the really important factors. So I would say Global Kids Online research certainly shows differences in terms of inequalities. We haven't got a means of showing the importance of access and connectivity, but of course, lots of other research makes that clear, that across much of the global south, questions of access and connectivity are vital and a source of exacerbated inequality, kind of adding digital inequality to already existing inequalities. I think I've seen a lot of research in different parts of the global south where it's clear sometimes perhaps coming online a bit later has meant that children have gone mobile first. It's first of all access via phones, not always smartphones, but phones. Whereas in the global north, perhaps because access was a bit earlier, there was quite a focus for a long time on the personal computer as a point of access, which is a different device in terms of its keyboard and its ability to be shared, and the question of where is it put, and so forth. So, I think there are, and then there are many, many cultural factors that I think we need and more research for, but some of the risks seem to me intensified in the global south because tech companies provide fewer protections in the global south, because there are intense pre-existing circumstances of violence or inequality or discrimination. But on the other hand, I think sometimes in the global north, there are also intense areas of protection because in the global north, children are often the canaries in the coal mine. They're where they get the tech first before regulators and adult society has become aware of the possible risks. So it's a very complex picture, and I would love to hear thoughts. We do in Global Kids Online, we do have participation from so many different parts of the world. So
I think we can see all of those things with games such as the Blue Whale, etc. So I'll move on to the next question. So some of these questions are from audience members. Online risks for children are content risks, conduct risks, contact risks. You have extended this classification to include contract risks as well. So can you throw some light on this?
Yes. So for a long time we began with the classification of risks because it wasn't clear always to governments, to policymakers, which risks mattered. And very often policymakers focus on a particular risk, let's say cyberbullying or pornography were perhaps the two earliest risks that gained attention of policymakers. And both of those could be seen as, or both of those were often interpreted negatively as somehow creating the child as responsible. It is children who perpetrate cyberbullying to each other, and it's often children who are said to seek out pornography. And so with some risks, it's been, policymakers are tempted to blame the victim. And it seemed to us very important that we should look at the whole array of risks, contact, conduct, content, and contract, so that we could see that it's a wide array and that children play a different role in relation to those different risks. And we have thought about content risks, not to blame the child at all, but to recognize the power of digital providers of content. Contact risks, the fear of the stranger, the fear of the groomer, to kind of often be ways in which children are manipulated by adults online and tricked or blackmailed into abusive forms of participation. Conduct risks may seem to position the child as both perpetrator and victim, but what we've tried to do is recognize the overlap, that in crucial ways child perpetrators are also child victims, and that the phenomenon of conduct risks is much more complex than it can seem in its kind of simplest forms. And then contract risks, which was the heart of your question, I think there's been a lot of debate in the last 5 years about how to recognize the shift within digital platforms, if you like, the shift to the platformization of society, away from a focus on websites, on communication apps, to recognize that these platforms are becoming the infrastructure for children's lives, and it's not just their leisure, but their learning, perhaps their work, their family connection, and so forth. And that the fact of those platforms and the particular kind of contract that they create, that they force with children, is itself a source of risk, of harm. And so we mean particularly the datafication of childhood, the way in which to participate in your world on platforms often means that your personal, sensitive, identifying data is taken and can be used in ways that are discriminatory, can be used in ways that have open up commercial exploitation, and can be used in ways which might have long-term consequences into the future that we at this point cannot even know. So these seem to us around the contract and the very limited possibility, if any, that children as users have to manage the terms under which their relationship with the platforms has consequences for their lives.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. We have a question from Professor Usha Rodriguez, who has joined us on Zoom. She wants to slightly shift the discussion towards media literacy. So she has two questions. What is the responsibility of giant media platforms in this space to combat sharing of misinformation? And also, if training a few thousand people in developing countries about using their platforms sufficient to solve the issue of media literacy and misinformation? That's the question. It's two questions.
Thank you very much for the question. And in introducing myself, I might have said that, yes, I've always been interested in media literacy. And I would, there are many definitions, but I begin to think media literacy refers to the knowledge which citizens need to thrive in a digital world. And whatever that knowledge is, they need it to be citizens, because now our lives are significantly digitally mediated. So what knowledge do people need? I think the critical point I would make about media literacy, which I think speaks to your point, is that literacy, that the knowledge they need is always dependent on the design and structure and affordances of the digital environment. And the digital environment is, we can think of it as technology, as platforms, as infrastructure of networks, but of course it's also created by corporations, it's created by industry, it's created by those whose economic and business interests are often very different from those of the public interest and those of children's best interests. And so the whole edifice that we call the digital environment is driven by particular interests, which leads to what we've all seen, the proliferation of disinformation, the huge amounts of fake news and problematic content. It's also led to the mechanisms by which that content is distributed. So I'm thinking now of the kind of algorithmic mechanisms which harness and push and direct the flow of content in particular ways that are diversified according to what the platform knows of individuals and their previous experiences. And all of that is pretty opaque. I think in many countries, the people are learning fast, but always the tech is ahead. And so at a certain point, I think it is just unreasonable to expect that any number of thousands of media literacy educators can go out and teach ordinary people in their busy lives, not always with much education. How can those few thousand possibly teach people about the cutting edge of complex, opaque, at times manipulative platforms and technological organizations? So, there is just a limit, and it makes no sense to say education is the answer. Education is the answer. I'm a passionate believer in what education can do, but education cannot solve all the problems that technology is creating in our society. And so media literacy must be understood in a way that is complementary with a critical analysis of our platform infrastructure and the operation of digital services. And if we see them going hand in hand, then we can see what needs to be addressed at the level of design or regulation or business incentives, perhaps, and what could be addressed at the level of education. And I think literacy is a good word. You may be thinking about it in translation, and it doesn't always work in different countries. But if we think back to reading and writing, the ABC, if a piece of writing is in a language you don't know, or if a piece of writing is in a handwriting that you cannot decipher, then it doesn't matter how much education you have. You can't read that text. You cannot decipher that illegible piece of content. And I think that's the problem for media literacy as well. There will always be other languages, other forms of opacity and complexity. And so we should educate people as we can with 10 times the effort that we already have, but we cannot solely rely on media literacy as a strategy for ensuring well-being in a digital world.
Thank you, Professor Livingstone. I'm actually based right now in Melbourne, so that's why I'm on Zoom. I agree with the complex. It is a very complex issue, and also the fact that platforms are owned by private companies, and that creates much more complexity in this whole issue. I mean, there are different literacies: media literacy, information literacies, digital literacies, and then just literacy itself. So I always found it quite, I've always seen it as quite cynically that when Google or Facebook or one of these platforms, they go to India, they go to some of the other developing countries, and they say, oh yeah, we have trained about 10,000 people, or we have trained about 50,000 people in this day-long workshop. And you kind of think, what are you talking about? Seriously? I mean, the problem of fake news and disinformation, misinformation is so huge that you really can't solve that. And then the cynic in me also sees that what they are doing is, in these workshops, they are teaching them to use their tools in the name of media literacy. Anyway, that's my.
No, I completely agree, and that was very eloquently put. So I would add, there has been a little published critique of the approach that Google takes to digital literacy. And I think what's very striking, they say the same in Britain, we've talked to so many thousands, is that they talk about how to use the settings on the interface for the end user, but they don't talk about the business model and the technological infrastructure behind the screen.
Yes.
So the data ecology remains completely invisible. It's very selective what they teach. And there is, I've been urging much more independent evaluation of all claims, because of course, we do need more educational initiatives. I think they should not be permitted in schools if they only teach them for one service, just to promote their own product. But they also need to be independently evaluated. And as we know, as educators, education on a complex issue cannot be done in one day. Education is a life process, and that's why school lasts years and university lasts years, and workplace education happens over time. And one day will not stem the crisis of misinformation. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I have another question on education. So just picking up on that thread. In India, the edtech industry is booming, with content offered for kids as well, especially between the ages of 0 to 5 years old. And they consume a lot of internet, so edtech apps and things like that. So should of this on children's social, psychological, and cognitive development?
Sorry, the very last bit of the question was, what should we, about their development?
So what are the implications of EdTech
yeah.
apps?
Yeah.
on
Well,
children?
this is a big question, and I think one that has not been. I'm sorry to say, I think it's one area in which the academy has been slow to grasp the rise of EdTech as a phenomenon, a global phenomenon, significantly, I think, led by enterprise and innovation in India, and where India is becoming very critically part of the a global EdTech business model, which is not always very interested in education at all. I mean, it's a new market, and it's a lucrative market because everyone must be educated or should be educated. So it's a brilliantly it's a brilliant new business model, and I would say there are so many unresolved difficulties. I mean, one is you particularly highlighted very young children. I think the research for very young children, what I see from the systematic evidence reviews, is quite a mixed picture, in which there is some evidence that for children, for young children, there can be some benefits of sometimes kind of rote learning, a drill and skill learning. It can help especially in some contexts where children don't have other educational opportunities, but the scope of what is taught is so narrow and so dictated by the company rather than what the child wants to learn. So, you know, with my child rights hat on, the whole point about those early years is child-led learning, and child-led learning in interaction with actual other people who are supportive and kind of scaffold their learning. So I think it's easy to focus. We should focus on the technology and the business, but it means the privatization of education. It means the platformization of education, and in this debate, we sometimes forget to ask what education do we hope for? What do we want children to be learning? Because the EdTech companies will have an advisory board of the great and the good, often from our universities, often us. You know, we will collectively, I won't, but many colleagues do advise them, and with all the best will in the world. But then what comes out at the other end will also be heavily shaped by corporate business interests and the kind of the importance of a scalable and kind of systematic model of, you know, how to deliver education in packages and in small units. And well, so you can see I'm skeptical too, and we haven't even got to the question of data, but this is sucking up an enormous amount of crucial data from children.
Yeah, so coming back to internet safety, do you think that parents' awareness of internet safety and safe internet use practices are a contributing factor for children's online safety as well?
Yes, I would always advocate parental support and knowledge, and parents also need digital literacy and digital safety training and awareness. It's only one part of the story, and what I'm seeing, so now you'll have to tell me about the context in India. What I'm seeing in Britain is children becoming quite cautious. They have been told about safety so much that they are almost, they know they can use this app or that app, but they are almost now too cautious to do the exploration, the experimentation, the kind of free child-led learning that and experience and engagement that originally we thought the internet was for, and it's so yeah, so somehow, you know, there's all the, in addition to guiding parents to take on this responsibility and leaving aside the problem that not all children have parents who can or do, it's like literacy. There's also this question, how much do we leave to the parents and how much do we embed safety by design into the infrastructure of digital technologies, so that everyone can be freer because the problems are dealt with at source. And I see Usha as a, I know in Melbourne right now, but in Sydney, the Australian Safety Commissioner's Office has probably led the way in thinking about safety by design, so that we don't have to rely totally on parents who have many other concerns.
That is true.
Thank you, Professor. So I'll move on to the next question. So this is a pretty specific question. So the pandemic has increased children's screen time dependence, but research tells that parental mediation methods are context specific. So policy recommendations of ideal screen time for children may not always be possible in practice. So how do we overcome this policy practice contradiction?
I actually think one could put this point for almost any area of our digital lives, that we can have some policies which are fairly abstract and high level, and then practice differs in different circumstances. And so here is the difficulty. So practice should differ in different circumstances. It's appropriate that everything is context specific and negotiated in the particular context. But at the same time, some of those contexts can allow for variation, which is problematic for children. So if one context allows for parental mediation, which is highly restrictive, highly protectionist, then children's civil rights and liberties might be the cost. Children live in very different kinds of circumstances, sometimes with one parent, sometimes with two, sometimes with grandparents, sometimes with an extended family, sometimes in alternative care and so forth. So we have to, sometimes with no parents, we have to allow for a mediation, an adult mediation, which is safe and supportive and caring, while leaving it open who does that and how they do that and what support they have for it. I see more and more research on parental mediation, really emphasizing the importance of enabling mediation, that rather than the parent's role being to police, to limit, to restrict, to ban and to punish children, I think more and more of the evidence is in favor of evaluating, explaining, sharing, joining in, empowering children. And in many parts of the world, I think that message is still in some ways at odds with the ethos of parenting within the culture. And sometimes I think that's where there are so many tensions around digital technologies and screen time. It's because there is this very lively negotiation between a traditional set of values about parenting and the particular demands of a changing and often quite kind of foreign technology.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have about 20 minutes left, I think, and we'll open the discussion. And I think Professor Sanjay wants to ask A question, yes. Yes, yes.
Professor Livingstone, good afternoon
Hello.
from here. We use your readings for our PhD course as part of the both old ferment as well as the new ferment in communication and media studies. Your 2006 paper seemed to suggest that the Katz and the Lazarsfeld personal influence on audience has a contextual relevance. And the 2018 paper on audience and datification seems to continue in the same trend. But my question is methodologically, if datification has completely defined the child and its habits, what are media researchers and policy analysts going to do? Is it a kind of a recurrent critical discourse we need to engage in when the damage is already being done, continuously being done? So what methodological insights you would advise to students from different parts to tackle this question of policy intervention in child's rights? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. So my 2018 article on datification was written in a moment of a bit of a passion because I heard many scholars talking about datification and datification by essentially at heart corporate capitalism to extract the value of people's lives and appropriate it. And that is happening. There is no question in my mind. But it isn't totalizing. And I don't think it will ever be totalizing. And what I tried to do in that paper was to identify some of the really crucial ways in which of what is left out in you extract the data is full of error, it is collected for business purposes which don't capture the whole person, it makes problematic and bizarre inferences about us, as we all know when we go online and they invite us to buy the thing we bought last week. You know, that it's full of many limitations, and I think it was, so that paper was in a way an effort to identify what is left out. You might say we're in the middle of a process and datification will continue and become more totalizing, and we are entering a brave new world of real corporate takeover, perhaps. I don't, when I go and I talk to children, and I see that they are still very significantly in a world of human interaction and values and judgments about what is fair and desire and enthusiasm and energy. That's where I take my heart when thinking how to advise policymakers, and that's what I see as the kind of the fertile ground for a child rights focus. So I think for us as academics, there are many roles. I see quite a lot now of communication scholars who are becoming more advocates and even activists in relation to policy and political or institutional change. And it's an interesting moment for communication scholars. I think that with the rise of platform society, we have some new challenges for this kind of advocacy and activism roles, but we I also believe we can't all do that. And thinking of your PhD program, we need people who sit back and critique the activists and the advocates, because they will be, everyone makes compromises in going out and trying to have an impact. So we need the critics who sit back and observe, and we need those who continue to collect the very best rigorous evidence that can be collected on all kinds of things, not necessarily just the topic of the moment, because we need that evidence base. And increasingly, as everyone focuses on how society is changing, we need an evidence base that is sustained over time, so that we have a view of what is really changing. And things are not always changing as much as policymakers would have us believe. So I think there are many roles for scholarship and research, but some of them are rightly, as it were, out there, and some of them are more in here. And what I really value is the space for debate between those different perspectives, as we all make our kind of different pathway with what communication knowledge offers. I haven't gone back to what I wrote in 2006, which I'm trying to remember now, about the Katz and Lazarsfeld model. But
there, I think your argument was the personal influences in the era of post mass media, legacy media, still has some relevance and validity to probe the undercurrents of the relationship. That's what I could gather from that reading.
I think so. So think about the pandemic. I think we're all thinking, how has the communication, have our communication practices changed during the pandemic? Again, might be different in India. What I see in Europe is there was so much talk, especially that children just wanted to be on the screen all the time, just wanted to be online all the time. And when the pandemic hit, we realized, no, they want to go to school in person. They want to see their auntie and their cousin and their friends in person. They want to. So we have had a bit of a revival, a recognition that actually we all lead quite local lives, and children especially need to see the, I don't know, the 3 or 10 or 20 people who are. And then the other thing we saw as our lives went online and we all zoomed or tried to do remote learning, was how important the mediators are. The child might be on Zoom with their teacher and their classmates, but there may be a parent or older brother or sister who is doing that personal influence role, doing that mediating role in person, perhaps just outside the screen, but they are making sure it works, or plugging in the cable, or trying to support in some way and remember what was said so that they can repeat it later and continue the learning after. So we get very focused on our screens, but I think there's a lot of interpersonal interaction around the screen, which is personal influence is quite hierarchical, that the community leader spreading to the people. I think our personal influence now is often more hierarchical, as we scaffold for each other how to make the digital communication work for us.
Just a follow-up question. From a political and economic perspective, when was the child left to its innocence and growing up? I'm reminded of 1973 article by Melody, Children in the Era of Television. The whole dynamics of Sesame Street, the definition of what a child should grow, what kind of toys, the Barbie phenomenon, etc. What do we do about that? The child is already defined in the era and life and the parental are the digital natives already. So that is one concern I have, and I don't necessarily expect a response from you. Or do we, as Shiva said yesterday, stop and think? Thank you.
Well, Siva's advice was very good. Yes, we should all stop and think, or at least slow down. So, yeah, I think we all carry with us an image of when children's lives were better. And in the book I just wrote on Parenting for Digital Future, I interviewed lots of parents about how they approach their parenting role, and often they talk about their childhood. And perhaps what was significant about Bill Melody's article in 1973 was that it was perhaps 20 or 30 or 40 years after his, he was looking back to, we all look back to our childhood, sometimes with horror. This is something to avoid. This is why I want to make things better. And sometimes with nostalgia. That was when it was good, and we always try to get back to that. So whatever the childhood, we are motivated by the gap between what we remember and what we are living through, and for many parents also by the gap, the distance between now and the 20 years hence when our children will be adults, which none of us can really imagine, I think. But if I ask you, how do you see life in 2042, many people think in terms of science fiction. That will be when the robots have taken over and we have all got a chip or here, and the walls are watching us. It was very Big Brother. So I think these ideas of innocence and nostalgia, they're different in every culture, but I think for many people they are however many years ago it is that we were 7.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I think we have time for a couple more questions, I think. If anybody.
So the next question is, what direction should future research on children and internet look at, in your opinion? And what are the emerging aspects that must be studied?
Thank you for the question. I think one area I would love to see more research is research which takes a historical perspective on the present. Picking up the point I just made, that we always think of ourselves now looking at how things have changed, and we don't always get the evidence for how things were 10 or 20 or 40 years ago. I would love to see a more kind of evidenced case for change, to understand the particularities of what really has changed and how much changes because the context changes, and how much is really transformed, and what is better or worse, and how do we make that judgment. Some areas of research must continue and become greater. So I think questions of as technology advances, questions of inequalities were there from the very beginning when we first talked about the digital divide, and they are still as intense, perhaps even more intense, with more recognition of intersectionality and different forms of inequality. But so it's not a new topic, but it remains absolutely critical. And then I don't know, one thing personally that I am curious about and I don't hear is as you know, I'm not an economist, but I keep hoping to hear of different business models, new ways in which the platforms will or maybe they will be gone, maybe they will get broken up. But so many conversations about childhood or about everyday life begin with questions of what could be changed and what does the research suggest, and they end with a kind of dystopian despair about the power of corporate capitalism to just dictate through technology. And so any research that can diversify that future, I think would give us all something to work with in debating. You know, communication studies has often said, you know, can we imagine things different? Can we imagine the alternatives? And it's becoming very hard to imagine alternatives.
On that note, I think are there any more questions? Thank you very much. We look forward to your visit to our institution. And in case you have the time and energy for a collaborative project on children in the global South, including South Asia, we are here to work with you and offer our own contextual insights to your work.
Brilliant.
Please let us know, and we are open to the idea of collaborative and initiative research. Thank you so much for your time and being with us this afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Usha ma'am, yeah.
I'm sorry, Usha, you had a question?
No, I just said thank you. Thank
you. Okay. All right. Fine.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel I have not quite visited, but almost, and it's wonderful to be in communication. So thank you.
We'll just take a picture.
We'll take a picture, right? Sure. Okay. Ready?
They'll just come on stage.
2 minutes of your time. Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.